I'm untangling. This is not me. If I do not show this slide, then I get asked, so this is not me. It's not true that I'm upset about Hawkeye not getting his own Marvel movie, and I've instead decided to become a lucrative developer. This may be me. He looks like he could probably kill people and get away with it, but you know, old profile pictures do that. Oh, I haven't changed my presenter slides. I've done this in every possible amateur way where I've not even rehearsed this. So my slides are gone. Hang on. I'm from Singapore. I am one of the two people who run Singapore CSS. There are lots and lots of meetups in Singapore. When I moved to Singapore about 3.5 years ago, there was no CSS anything. It was JavaScript, Ruby, like you name it, there's something. And it was on a Slack channel. It's like, why is there no Singapore CSS? Like, what's wrong with this country that we can't do anything like that? So in about 2 hours, we had a logo, our first meetup, and everything kind of happened. I'd love to be like this, but in practice, I think because I've been doing this an awfully long time, I'm probably closer to this guy. I could be this guy because he looks a bit younger. Need to work on the facial hair, I think. I've been doing web things for a very, very long time. I may not look it, but I've been writing HTML for over 21 years, which means that I'm really familiar with stuff like this. I have lots of theories about cats. And I did pre-warn Mandy that there would be a lot of cat slides tonight. You knew what you were in for.
It's fine. Carry on.
You may regret this decision later on. If you ask me after a beer or two about why the internet and cats are so interrelated, I can talk too long about it. But, you know. I mean, the early days, HTML was first. And that was it. Like, images came along, which were pretty exciting. Eventually there was this thing called JavaScript, which made everything so much easier and clearer because adding extra complications is always great. There was no real way to style things. There were inline font tags and things like that, which were horrendous. Not every browser even supported them, so you had to do multiple ways of doing things. It was ugly. Styling was just really, difficult, basically. You'd have to have one version of your site for IE and another version for Netscape, and literally completely separate HTML code because you just couldn't do it that way. Then CSS kind of nursed its way in, and everything became a lot easier. I mean, CSS wasn't supported everywhere at first, so there was the CSS version of the site and the non-CSS version of the site. Like, come on, I'm still writing my code twice. That's ridiculous. And that's it. That's the end of my talk because CSS has made everything perfect. Thank you. Oh, wait, no. Unfortunately, with CSS, things are a bit heavier than we really expected. It looks like a nice little fish, but unfortunately, it's a very big fish, and not everyone understands the fish. And even though JavaScript's a bit more understood now than it originally was, it's a little bit more complex than we would have hoped. And from the early days, we now have like Atomic CSS, there's BEM, OOCSS, Max, JavaScript kind of flavored CSS and, strawberry flavored CSS and everything else. And it's pretty scary. I mean, what does CSS even stand for? Does anyone even know? It's just cat something computer stuff, S something? I don't know. I'm the millennial expert, ask me. I could go on about cats and computers for a long time, but I should actually jump to code instead. So I'm going to end the awkward slides and jump to that. Most of what I'm talking to you about tonight really is to do with like the problems that people have with CSS. That usually they don't really understand CSS very well, and they come up with lots of solutions to try to fix it. Atomic CSS seems to be one of those. I mean, functional CSS broadly. where the cascade, like, let's not mention the cascade because cascade makes people run screaming from the room. So instead, let's just come up with all sorts of different ways to make the cascade go away, and then CSS is a lot more manageable, isn't it? But the cascade is what CSS is all about. And this is an article by Hayden Pickering from 2014 about the lobotomized owl. Hayden Pickering in particular, don't listen to anything I've got to say tonight. Just remember Hayden Pickering, Google the guy, and you'll learn far more than anything I've got to tell you. One thing he's quite noted for is pushing HTML and CSS for what they are. You don't need BEM, you don't need CSS modules or anything else like that necessarily. You can just learn how CSS works and save yourself a lot of time. So most of what I'm actually here to, I'm not even complaining about something, which is unusual for me because usually I am. I'll just show you a couple of things about like what you can do with CSS, because the selectors are usually, people think they know them, but they don't really. And there are things that can save you a lot of time. So I'll just show you a couple of really simple things. There's this is on CodePen. You'll see this tab over here, JS. I don't even know what that means because I run Singapore CSS, so I'm just get rid of that. But no, thank you. So everything's a lot clearer already. I mean, sibling selectors are pretty awesome. So here I've got a whole bunch of paragraphs. Let me scroll down. Paragraphs are great. I'm going to use the universal selector. What's a universal selector? The universal selector selects everything within a particular scope. In this instance, I'm setting the margin of everything to 0. You could do this so many other ways, but the key thing to really getting your head around CSS and making it maintainable is to not write code as much as you possibly can. And using selectors like the universal mean that you can write, like this is everything. I'm not using an ID, a class or anything. I can override this anywhere I like, which is just great. So, you're looking at the beautiful HTML here. You may decide maybe you want some margins again because someone's just gone and removed them all. Thanks very much for your reset. What can I do? Can I add some paragraph margins or something like that? No. That's where you're wrong. What you really want to do is use the lobotomized owl. Like this is the sibling selector. So something next to something should have a margin top. But what's that really mean? Like something next to something. Should that one have something, but it's not actually next to something. Actually, it is within the DOM that I've got here. But the point is with this is I can, like you might have to use the first paragraph I don't want a top margin on, but all the other ones I do. So what you'd probably end up doing is something like, let's just get rid of that code. You do element selector, margin top, 1M, and then I'll do first child, margin top, 0, because I don't want that. But with the sibling selector, I'm just saying when one is next to the other, then you can do something. So the second and subsequent are automatically selected. If you don't know your selectors, it becomes a lot more difficult. Look at that, less code, amazing. Like you can't gzip that away. Lobotomized owl is really just something that can be applied to all elements on the page. But knowing how to use your siblings makes a big difference. I'll be loath to run a CSS meetup and not mention grid because it's the best thing ever. So let's just jump into some more code. Okay, so next up we're going to Descendant selectors. I've got there's a grid container, if you have a look up there, and then I've got things underneath it. If I just put my display grid in there, this is going to be interesting because it's going to jump a bit. There we go. So I've now got a grid. I forgot how to use the repeat in grid and I was too lazy to Google it. So I've just done the 1FR thing, which is terrible, but you're not here to learn about my bad code. I've set up a really basic grid here. It's 4 columns across. That's great. What I've actually got is only 2 columns, so what can I do with interesting selectors? I can use the direct descendant. My direct descendant says underneath my grid container, everything that's directly underneath it, treat like this. And really, really simple cascade, like you don't have to think any further than that, and suddenly my code makes a lot of sense. I don't care that there's a definition list and there's a paragraph, they get treated equally because it's using a universal selector. You could write so much code around doing this any other way. But these are kind of theoretical examples because you'd probably have a grid container or something like that anyway. So we can get on to something more complicated, which is a nav. Let's go. Right. You're excused. So first up, I've got my basic nav. I've got a UL inside the nav. Actually, I should scroll down so you can see what's going on. Pretty normal. I've scoped it within the UL. Next, I want to use my direct descendant. You might say it's a nav, why do I even need this? You could just do that. You could potentially just do that. But what I'm doing here is specifically saying that every LI directly underneath an UL, and probably I want to even make it more specific like this. So when I have a nav that has a direct descendant of a UL, which has a direct descendant of an LI, then make it inline block. So I've got a pretty standard looking menu down the bottom there. Then let's get a sibling involved and do some margin. I'm using Sass here because I'm lazy, I'm sorry. So just like that, I now have, I should have had some more padding or something because it's right down the bottom. I've now got my left margin only on the second and subsequent menu items. Like, there's so much code I don't have to write just there. The benefit of what I'm doing at the top here is really apparent when you make the menu more complicated. So let's say, for example, that this is going to be, oh, a class. Wow, he uses classes. This is going to be a submenu. Underneath my submenu, I've got my UL. I should have written this earlier, but now I'm regretting my past decisions. Item I. Now it's item J. Everything's intentional. Okay, so if I look at my menu, it just looks completely messed up. Yes, I need to mark it as a submenu. Might be a way around that, possibly. But the key thing here is the layout of the submenu items is not inline block, and they don't have the left margin applied to them. So I don't have to think about overriding that because I've got my selectors as pretty general there in the first place. If I then want to go a bit further and say that, let's pretend there's JavaScript, is that what it's called? Setting a state here. I'll call that aria hidden. I can now say that, this is annoying me now. Where am I? My context is lost on me. So if I've got an LI with aria hidden, true, then display none. And refresh. Where's my selector wrong? What have I done wrong? I've made a mistake. So I really need a, let's just do that. Hey, there we go. There's always the risk. I mean, if you start thinking about your CSS in this way, you never ever write important. There is no such thing as important. Like those t-shirts that have important on it. What's that even mean? Because even though I've not had to get deeply involved and write 10,000 classes in this, if you get deeply into BEM, you'd have classes all over this. if you're into atomic CSS, there's stuff everywhere. It gets really nasty. Just knowing a couple of little really basic things of CSS, like I've only got a few lines of code here, and like this is half a site written already. I'm wary of time because I've not timed this in any way whatsoever. So let's jump to a real example of something that saved me a ton of time by actually thinking about my selectors. I mean, I say this, I make the mistakes that everyone else makes. There's nothing good about my code. Like really, if you looked at it, you'd just run away screaming. Usually I'll write it the bad way and then I'll stop and think about it and say, maybe I could have used a different selector here. This particular instance, this code pen is showing a fault in Firefox, so it renders correctly in Safari. I'm using flex direction column to try to expand the height, and the goal is to make sure that these price amounts down the bottom align with each other, so I can have any number of elements on the way in between, and the price is always going to be down the bottom. Now the trick to make this happen, so I've got flex on the container, I'm display column to make sure it goes down. I want the second last element to grow. Now, the first thing you're probably going to do is get into your JavaScript and say, yeah, just get React to do that for me. But there's CSS for this. CSS does everything, except for the things it doesn't. So you ended up with this here. I've got my inner container. That doesn't really matter. But now I've got this evil-looking emoji-looking thing. And I'm looking for the nth last child. This works in IE. Like, you don't even have to worry about browser compatibility because we've had these advanced selectors for such a long time that it's no longer a thing you need to think about. So just by doing nth last child flex grow 1, I can now go in there and add as many extra elements as I like. If I can find my bit in the code. So I can add another paragraph in here. Refresh CodePen. Probably am. I'm not on any box now. Come on, CodePen. Maybe it's lost what it's doing. Now, you don't have to save for it to refresh, technically. All the point of my example is now lost on everyone, which is great. Go on, free Wi-Fi. What's really bad is this is the last point I'm going to make. So it wasn't just me. This is box 2. Let's just write the HTML for it anyway and see if it's going to catch up or not. It's not going to catch up. What you would see is basically what the CSS says, is the second last element adapts that. There is so much code you could do to do exactly the same thing. I mean, this is the beauty of CSS, this is the good and bad of it. There are about 20 different solutions for exactly the same thing. But some of them are just better than others. We could sit here till the end of the night and this may not load, so I'm just going to abandon ship at this point. All right, back to what I usually look like when I'm typing as a cat. Yeah, that's basically it. Learn some CSS selectors. What you've learned tonight is about the lobotomized owl. Look it up. Look up Hayden Pickering as well to learn a lot about what he does. And when you're looking at doing something, you think, gee, this is really convoluted. Have a look at your CSS selectors and have a look around. It's kind of like the different array methods in JavaScript. There are about 20 different ways to handle an array now. There are lots of different things you can use in CSS just to save yourself a lot of time. I am Cleaner on Twitter and Tumblr. I've put my slide share on here, but there are like 20 different cat pictures in here. So you could just Google cats and learn as much as I could possibly show you there. Otherwise, thank you very much.